Hi, this is Mrs. Anderson, and today I'm going to talk to you about the compare or contrast essay. Specifically, my hope is by the end of this essay, you'll understand whether you'll be comparing or contrasting. You will understand the general structure of the essay, and you'll have a better idea of the first part of the thesis, the theme statement, for both a compare or a contrast essay. So let's get down to the format of this essay. Notice that I said compare or contrast. You're not going to do both. You're either going to choose to compare the Odyssey to a poem you read this unit or contrast the Odyssey to a poem we read this unit. And ultimately, you're going to have two body paragraphs, which means you will have two supporting points. Now, here's an important distinction as to how the compare or contrast essay is different from other essays you've written in the past. You're going to be having two works of literature, the Odyssey and the poem, and you need to make sure that you have two pieces of evidence per body paragraph. So that means one piece of evidence is going to be coming from the Odyssey, and the other piece of evidence is going to be coming from that poem that you choose to compare or contrast to the Odyssey. Now, here's where things can get a little bit dicey for compare-contrast essays. Because you're required to have two pieces of evidence per body paragraph, one from each work that you're comparing or contrasting, you also have to account for the fact that when you have a two-part theme, sometimes you need two pieces of evidence per work per paragraph. So you could be looking at perhaps 4 pieces of evidence in a single paragraph. So what I tried to show you here is the possibility of different body paragraphs for compare-contrast essays. The first body paragraph, they begin with evidence from the Odyssey, and then they have evidence from the second work or poem. Things were very easy in this case, that they found a perfect piece of evidence that showed or demonstrated their entire theme, so they only needed one quote per work. Now let's take a look at the second body paragraph, because that's where things got a little bit more challenging. If they had a two-part theme, something like love makes people behave irrationality, they had to find an example of love from the Odyssey and then another example of the irrational behavior, because they didn't have it in one quote. Fortunately, it looks like in the second work of literature, they found one quote to prove the entire theme. But that's why there are 3 pieces of evidence in that second body paragraph. So the lesson that I'm hoping that you're getting from these sample body paragraphs is that while you are required to have 2 pieces of evidence per paragraph, one from each work of literature that you're comparing or contrasting, that may not be your magic number. Maybe you'll need 3 pieces of evidence per body paragraph, or even 4, depending on your theme. And you will be the person that needs to ultimately make that determination. So now that you have a better idea about the structure of your essay, let's talk about your thesis statement. And today we're specifically going to focus on the first part of the thesis statement, which is the theme statement. All the same rules apply that we have discussed all year when we're talking about theme statements. Your theme statement should be argumentative, insightful, universal, concise, and focused on a thematic difference or similarity. Notice that focus is still a requirement, and you need to eliminate statements that have and or in them. So let's start with the comparison theme structure first. So if you're writing a comparison essay, your theme should include both author's last name and a transition word to make it clear to the reader that you are engaging in a comparison essay. You don't need to include the author's titles, only because they're going to be included probably earlier in the introduction. And what you see here is an example of a comparison using Fitzgerald and Steinbeck's works. Notice in this sample that the theme statement that is used is very similar to a theme statement that you would normally write. The only exception is that now there are 2 authors' names, but this writer has remained universal, controversial, concise. So all the elements of a traditional theme statement are there. It's just now that we're talking about 2 works of literature as opposed to 1. So where we start to get into a real difference in theme structures is in the contrast essay, no pun intended there. So previously, if you had a thesis statement, your theme and your supporting point, it would have been 2 sentences maximum. But now for a contrast essay, your theme statement is 2 sentences long. So ultimately your thesis will be 3. And where you see that real difference is in the first sentence of the theme. Anytime you're talking about a difference, you have to show that there is a legitimate reason to compare the two works in the first place. So even though it seems counterintuitive, you have to start with a similarity in order to explore a difference. You want to prove that you're comparing apples to apples or oranges to oranges. Otherwise, the difference that you speak of seems like it's not making sense. So the first sentence establishes that common similarity. So in the first sentence of your theme statement for a contrast essay, you need to include both authors' last names and indicate what topic the two authors have in common. And you want to use a transition word to show this is indeed a similar topic. So you see an example here where somebody is comparing the poetry of Whitman and Stevens, and they want people to know that both of those authors explore a necessarily closeness to nature in their works. It's not until you get into the second sentence of your thematic idea that you really begin to discuss the contrast of your essay. You again include the author's last names and then offer 2 thematic ideas. And these 2 thematic ideas should not just be differences, but opposition. So you want to make sure that you're operating within the same vein and you're trying to come up with an opposing idea and not just a different idea. Now, to clarify why opposition is so important is because opposition actually gives you something to contrast as opposed to just 2 things that could just be differing topics. So, for example, if I'm going to argue in on work that this author argues this group of people is strong, it would make sense that the opposing argument would be that these group of people are weak. And you see this opposition in the example that we have here in terms of how those 2 poetic authors discuss a closeness to nature. So when you look at Whitman's and Stevens's ideas about a closeness to nature, notice that that first sentence in the completed theme gives the topic that they have in common, the closeness to nature. However, Whitman and Stevens have opposing ideas. While Whitman's idea is active, go out and experience, Stevens' idea is much more passive, is that you can have an academic approach. So that's how you see the opposing nature of that thematic idea. Now, I do recognize that up to this point, I've only been discussing theme statements. And I know that in order to have a completed thesis, you also need to have a supporting point sentence. And I wanted to let you know that we will get to that skill, writing the supporting point sentence for a compare-contrast essay when we get to the end of this unit. So what I'd like to share with you now is a sample comparison paragraph, but a few notes as you look at this. First, this is not an essay, it's a single paragraph, so you're only going to see a claim. There's no thesis. But it does give you an idea of what a body paragraph looks like that has perfect quotes, meaning they only needed 1 for each work of literature. But when you look at this essay, understand that the Odyssey citations and spellings are going to be a little different because it's a different version of the Odyssey. So what you see here is the beginning part of the comparison essay. I'm also going to have a link to this on Schoology so you can access it that way as well. And what I wanted to point out in the claim is that they start with the Odyssey and then follow with Black Ships Before Troy. So the first piece of evidence that you see is from the Odyssey. So notice that the claim establishes the order of the works of literature, and that should also be reflected in the same order in the thesis. Here's the second half of the body paragraph. This would all be 1 paragraph, but I put it on 2 slides to make it easier to view. What I wanted to point out here was the overall reasoning at the end. Notice that this is a new part of the essay for you, and the whole point of the overall reasoning is to talk about both works in one place together, using word picks from both pieces of evidence to draw out the comparison. So now that you have some of the basics, what I'd like you to take some time to do now is to troubleshoot some compare contrast theme statements for errors. Note that some of the practice that you'll be doing will just be looking at errors that happen in thematic statements all the time, whether they are compare or contrast. In some cases, errors will be specific to a compare or contrast essay. So you can find that there's additional work for this on Schoology.